Reluctantly.
I get to talk to an officer of the Order of Canada today. He's an 8-time Juno Award winner and a member of the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. I think he's also a Costco member, because who doesn't want 3 kilograms of Ritz crackers, right?
No, I'm not a Costco member. I just get anxiety when I go in there.
He is a national treasure. Tom Cochrane has agreed to be my guest today.
Reluctantly.
Today's podcast brought to you by the Clayton Bellamy Foundation. ClaytonBellamyFoundation.org, supporting education and community-based programs in the province of Alberta by providing financial support to arts programs in need and by advocating the benefits and importance of arts education. ClaytonBellamyFoundation.org.
Reluctantly.
Yes, I have to see it, Terry.
You too, man. It's always a pleasure, always a treat when we get to chat, whether it's in person or over the phone or whatever the case may be. It's interesting. Before I get started, we were having a really interesting conversation about the way people are coming up in music these days compared to the way it started for you back in the mid-'70s, working, trying to make it, and then going back to a job on a loading dock, and then trying to make it again, and then going back to another loading dock job, or playing bars or coffee houses and all this stuff. It's so different today.
It's a different kind of phenomenon right now. There's kids that are creating businesses in their bedroom on the internet. It's just it's a different place out there.
Yeah. Well, you think about the TikTok phenomenon. Let's look back. So, the traditional, trajectory of a musician was, you would get together with the band and then you would, play the sweaty clubs and drive around in a van or a bus for, how many years. But the artists are just skipping that whole thing. They're skipping the clubs. They're skipping the small, soft seaters, and they're going from TikTok, like you said, straight to hockey arenas, playing for 17,000 people.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I heard of Noah Kahn, for instance, I mentioned it to Bill, my wingman on guitar, and Bill said, yeah, he just sold out 2 shows at Scotiabank Center in Toronto. So it's kind of a strange phenomenon coming from and you mentioned a bunch of those things, and I'm really proud of the latest one. Quite late, actually. I'm glad it's not posthumously that I was inducted into the Songwriter Hall of Fame, but I was inducted in the Songwriter Hall of Fame 3 weeks ago, I guess, or close to a month ago. And to me, that is what I am first and foremost, is a songwriter. I started playing coffee. I started in bands, and I loved playing rock music, of course. Started playing For Your Love like everybody else in my era, the Yardbird song, of course. And then from there, it just graduated to 3 or 4 different bands. And before you know it, I was captivated by the whole songwriter movement. And Bob Dylan made me realize, wow, this could be more than just writing simple pop songs. Not that there's anything wrong with simple pop songs, but you could tackle more meaningful stuff in your lyrics. And so when I hear some of these new artists like Zach Bryan, I'm really impressed with some of the writing and how in depth he gets with some of the aspects of his writing and the topics and the things he's writing about. And I think it's energizing and it's inspiring to see artists like that doing what they're doing. But you're right. I mean, a lot of artists unabashedly say, well, I've never worked any other job, Springsteen being the most noted. And he's very forthright about that. He says, I'm a working class hero, and yet I haven't played those jobs. Well, I can honestly say I did. I did work those jobs. I drove cab. I worked on the loading dock at
a meat packing plant or something, wasn't it?
Packing plant, yeah. Canada Packers, actually. I don't know if they exist now. Catching pneumonia in the middle of the summer, kind of loading lamb carcasses into a big freezer. And then, NCIL paints and all that stuff. And, it was good. It was a good education. It was important for me at any rate to have gone through that. And I don't often take the normal, or I haven't taken the normal route that way. And I think it's, if you live in a vacuum, then what do you really have to write about? I often say it's great, and a lot of the artists that I know and we know dedicate 100% of their time to just doing music. And to me, the world is a bigger place than that. And you can't live in a vacuum or a bell jar. You've got to write music that basically touches people in all walks of life. And best way of doing that is to experience those walks of life. So, doing regular jobs is a way to get your hands dirty, but also a way to educate yourself about what real people live through. So as shitty as it was working some of those jobs, especially cab driving, it was romantic initially, because I thought, this is kind of cool. I'm out in the streets and I'm living this life and I'm hearing real life stories. But after a while it becomes drudgery. I know that Kid Carson, who's and your boy's becoming quite an accomplished drummer. Kid Carson was a session guy in Toronto, and that I remember one day we're driving cab and he booked off late and I got to the fair early and we started fighting over this fare, and it was like about a $6 fare, and we both had our tire irons out from the cab. And then we both looked at each other and started laughing. And I didn't know who it was at that point, that it was Kid Carson. It was another musician actually trying to work an honest job to make a living and make ends meet until they could apply their craft. And we both laughed, and it was one of the later experiences where I said, I got to get out of this before that, and putting on about 40 pounds because I'd sit on the 10 post at Islington and Bloor and eat hamburgers and stuff.
And
slowly getting fatter. But, I think I've told the story before, and I told this story at the induction that, I was sitting outside Massey Hall one night and the doors were up, not up until like it was a July evening, but it was actually in December, looking back on it. And I wasn't quite 20 yet. And I got out of the cab and I went to the door, and that venerable old building the ventilation was terrible in it. So they had the doors open and this incredible music was wafting through the doors, and it was like a symphony but it was one man and one guitar and a weathered old voice and voice of experience. And it was the incredible, legendary Leonard Cohen. And it moved me. It was like a real epiphany, and it just moved me so much that I went back to the cab, put the keys on the seat, and I walked away. And it ended up that my first residual check, I had to pay for that cab because it got stolen. I made that last part up, but it makes a good story. Yeah. So that was it. And I went back when I tackled that, I went back and I said, no, I'm going to get some songs written and I'm going to get on with this. And that was a big turning point for me.
Was the cab driver after your stint down in Los Angeles? You went down to Los Angeles, tried to write for publishing or something, or movies or something like that?
Well, I had actually been driving cab on and off for a bit. Then I crewed out on a boat. They often make it sound like I was a waiter on a cruise ship, but it was actually a racing class catamaran, 50-foot.
Oh, wow.
Catamaran. So we took a passage from Port Credit, Ontario, across Lake Ontario, down through through Troy and the Hudson River, and out, and then down south. And we had a couple accidents on the way, and it was pretty rugged, that trip. I get seasick too, so it was a rugged trip. And then it was shortly after that I came home, and I decided to that experience with it was short. Well, it was actually after the Leonard Cohen experience, and then I came home and I was driving cab part-time, but really kind of gave it up, and then joined a band, Cochrane Cooper Band, great Dave Cooper, who actually grew up in the West End of Toronto, very much proponent. He even looked like Clapton. He was a big proponent of British blues and kind of a master at it. And so that was a pretty interesting band. After a couple of ill-fated trips to the East Coast where there was a gang that was terrorizing the Citadel Hotel out there, and we had the windows smashed in the truck, and we were on stage and they're screaming for Casey and the Sunshine Band and stuff. And this gang actually started throwing eggs at the stage. And Mark Spina, who was our bass player at the time, and he was a championship high school wrestler. He wasn't a big guy. So he was a, whatever you might call a welterweight wrestler. Anyways, he was airborne, flung himself off the stage and into this melee of characters, and they started beating him up. And then Jane Hunter, who was on keyboards, she jumped in there, and we're all jumping in there, and we got saved by some Croatian ship guys the crew, and they actually saved our ass and dragged this gang off of us. And there was about 10 of them. Anyways, Halifax could be a really rough place, but everybody loves it. And I love Halifax. I mean, the people are incredible, but it also can be a pretty rough place. It was, at least back then. So yeah, so we knew something was wrong with the place. I got up one day and I said, "Where did all the furniture go from the lobby?" And they said, "Well, I got all stolen last night by this gang." It was Halifax could be a rough place back then.
Is that one of the stories that you told on your Songs and Stories tour that you did with Bill?
No, I haven't told that story. That's why. The first night we did this last year, we actually did it out west, and we did a bunch of shows on Vancouver Island, which were great. I just loved doing those. And we did a few on the mainland, a couple in Saskatchewan. I can't remember whether we did any in Alberta. We weren't in Edmonton for that. But yeah, it was just like Billy goes, I said, "Well, what the hell, Songs and Story tour. I mean, what the hell am I going to talk about?" He says, "You'll figure it out." So I just started walking out on my own to play a couple of songs before Billy came out. We figured, well, how are we going to build the show? We don't have a band. I said, well, I'm going to approach it like the coffee houses of old, back in the mid 70s. And we basically, I'd go out there and basically talk for you talk for 15 friggin' minutes before you played anything. And some of these stories would come out. Not that one in particular. I haven't talked about that one. But no, I mean, we, that's funny. You end up going back to these places in Halifax, and it's just, people totally embrace what I'm doing, and that it was tough when you're starting out. So was Quebec. So were a lot of places. And that's why we have a bit of a disdain for the musicians union, because they did F all to help us out when we didn't get paid. I remember a guy pulled a gun on us in Quebec. We were playing some club in Quebec City, and he said, "Well, we're not paying you." And I said, "Oh, really? Okay, we'll see about that." And he says, "This guy says we're not paying you." And he puts a gun on the table. And he said, "You didn't finish your last set." I said, "Well, somebody pulled the fucking speaker cords out." And it was obviously an inside job. And he put a gun on the table. He said, "We're not paying you." I said, "Okay, that's fine by us." We're good. So, we wired home for the money and found a way to get home to pay for gas in the step van and that. So, yeah, those are called dues, Terry. And there was a lot of dues paid.
Yeah, that's no TikTok back in the mid 70s. So
no, it wasn't.
But I mean, a lot of the artists these days talk like they've walked the walk, yet they haven't. Sometimes it shows, Yeah, I appreciate the talent and everything like that, but there is something to be said about the stories. And well, here, let's look at it. You've got Nova Scotia and Quebec. Okay, so now there's 8 other provinces and 3 more territories. Have you got a story for each one of them?
Well, starting out with bands and that, and back then you got to remember it was like in the late 70s and early 80s. Agents back then, I mean, a lot of times, comedians and everybody would joke about agents, and it wasn't a real joke. I mean, the agents were ex-bikers and all kinds of characters, nefarious characters. I mean, it was a license. It was a wild frontier, basically. And so you had some irrefutable characters that were booking the band and booking a lot of bands back then. And some good guys came out of it, but it was pretty rough, some of the stuff and where they sent us. So a lot of times back then, because we were based out of Toronto, we got sent to the East Coast a lot. So that's why a lot of those initial experiences were from the East Coast. But it again, as weird as it was, I mean, the people were just wonderful. The people that took you in and supported you as a young artist, and that were great. But then it had this pretty rough side too. So you had to deal with that. But that's part of the dues, It's part of those stories that kind of make life a rich pageantry. And later, speaking of agents and all that, and people in the business, later when I got involved with Grapes of Wrath, for instance, producing Grapes of Wrath. So later in the 80s, it all became quite a bit more genteel. You had a lot of kids from university that were getting into management and becoming agents and all that. So it became a little bit more civilized. regulation to some people is a nasty word, but in some areas you need regulation. And I would definitely say in the area of booking way back in the early 80s and late 70s, it needed a bit of that for sure.
You probably end up getting into situations or venues where you didn't anticipate, or they didn't anticipate you, or you didn't anticipate, is it kind of like a good old Blues Brothers boys when they show up in the Jake and Elwood show up and they're like,
yeah, I mean, the whole chicken wire in front of the stage is not a myth. That happened. Played in a place in Smith Falls. I actually, the same place that Getty writes about in his book in Smith Falls. When we were there was a one-armed stripper. You're opening for her. So it was,
you were opening for her?
For a one-armed stripper, yeah. That was when I was still doing the acoustic stuff. So once you got past the Riverboat and a few other clubs that were pretty nice to play, it was a stretch. And that's, of course, when I started when I got full bore into cab driving. I said, okay, I'm out of here for a bit. I got to rethink this. And then later got back into it after the Leonard Cohen experience. But yeah, there were some pretty rough things. And I'd pull up my Ford Pinto station wagon and lug my own gear in there and set up my gear. Now you get these little Bose systems that are quite small and compact, sound incredible, that are very easy to set up. Back then I was lugging 120-pound cabinets to set up in these places that were, how do I say it, not so nice. So
ill-equipped.
Yeah. Ill-equipped, yeah. When we got out west, we found it quite a bit more, playing clubs in Edmonton, because we were in Edmonton every second week, it seemed. When Red Rider was starting out after the first record, and then a little bit into the second record before we started doing really nice venues. We weren't doing a lot of nice. The clubs were pretty good that we were playing in Vancouver, but I remember Bruce Allen saying, "Oh, Cochrane, you're not ready to graduate to halls." Well, we're playing halls all over the rest of the country. Well, Bruce had an interest in most of the clubs that we ended up playing in Vancouver. He was part owner for a lot of these clubs, so he liked to keep us in the clubs out there. But, that was a good education too, and they were well attended and they were packed. And of course, there's some nice ones like the Commodore in Vancouver. And then we get to Edmonton and we were playing a club called Lucifer's, I think you had way back then. I don't know if you remember that one.
Yeah.
And staying in band houses, and there'd be used condoms under the bed. The windows would be all smashed and there'd be green garbage bags on the window, and it was 30 below zero outside. So, but the people were fantastic, at those shows, and so supportive. And it didn't take us long in Edmonton in particular to graduate to bigger venues. And so Alberta's been pretty good to us, really good over the years.
In the early days of Red Rider, did you find that there was a region that really embraced you before other regions, or was it pretty uniform across the country? You said, being in Edmonton every second week and then out to the coast, but back to, Nova Scotia and Ontario and so on. Or what? I just remember hearing some bands, they would get really popular in one zone, not necessarily where they were from. Right. It would get really popular in one area and all of a sudden blow up from there. Did you find that happen?
Edmonton, and I'm not just blowing smoke because, you're a venerable legend in the market, but Edmonton was incredibly supportive. I to be perfectly frank with you, Terry, I'm not sure if we would have survived without Alberta in general. Calgary was supportive as well, but I'd say I give a big edge to Edmonton and how supportive they were. Then we had fringe benefits too as we graduated into the Jubilees of the world and venues of that nature. We were doing that right in the early 80s. So Steve McCauley, God bless him, he's East Coaster. He's retired out east now, but he was the Capital promo guy in Edmonton, and he was plugged in with Kevin Lowe and Mark Messier and of course Paul Coffey, who I still play golf with occasionally today. Paul sends me these cryptic messages. Like last year during their run, Paul would send me these very cryptic screenshots of his computer, and he'd be listening to, during their run, the 16 wins, he was listening to Red Rider before every game. till they lost.
Time for the spin doctors.
Then, back to the spin. Then I wouldn't get any more screenshots from it. And I say, "Oh, good to hear from you." Blah blah blah. What are you doing? And get nothing back. And then I congratulated him after the 16 game run, and then he sent a couple of texts thanking me and was excited and stuff. And that was a great move by Edmonton, by the way. And he didn't get enough mention. And knowing Paul, he probably didn't want them to. I'm just speculating on this, that he probably didn't want to undermine Knobloch, but I think he made a huge difference with the team last year on defense, and hopefully he'll do the same this year. I wish they hadn't lost Boberg and Holloway, but that's the nature of the cap in this modern NHL of ours. But back then we were hanging out with those guys, and I use the term euphemistically. They were like gunslingers in town. They were, but the good guys, they could do no wrong in Edmonton back then. It was pretty phenomenal hanging out with them. And I got a picture of them all, Songs, Wayne, but pretty much the full team coming to the Jubilee, and pretty fond memories back then. And so Paul and I, we play golf occasionally and now, and it was good to see them have that run last year, and hopefully they're back on their way. They seem to turn things around a little bit the last couple of games. So anyways, that's our little hockey discussion. But yeah, those are some of the fringe benefits of touring as much as we did back and forth. And, at that point I was kind of, more or less based in Vancouver. So we had some pretty good support in BC as well. So I'd probably say BC and Alberta, and of course the prairies were supportive. It's hard to get a real grasp of certain areas, because you have to remember, Alberta really is financially a lot more set than a lot of parts of the country. So they could support. They supported artists, and I think Edmonton is one of those towns. It's a great sports town. It's a great music town. And so, I'm not blowing smoke, but Alberta was very important in the early survival of Red Rider. And then later, obviously, some pretty important milestones in my life and career, and Red Riders, which was the symphony sessions, late great George Blondheim, who was a conductor on those and an arranger. And so, a lot of really, really important definitive moments happened in Alberta, and continues to be a very supportive province for me and my work, and I feel like it's a second home.
We'll be right back.
This podcast brought to you by The Terry Evans Show with Pete Potipko from 5 till 9 Monday through Friday on Edmonton's Classic Rock, K97. If you are in the Edmonton market, listen at 97.3 on your FM dial. Otherwise, listen live at k97.ca.
Reluctantly.
One of the first pictures I have of the two of us together, there's a third amigo in the shot, and it's Ryan Smith. You talked about your sort of relationship with Edmonton Oilers past. You and Smitty got along real well too. And even as we started going from the dynasty years into the not so awesome years of the Edmonton Oilers, the constant remained with you coming back. And is it fair to say that Edmonton almost kind of becomes your second hometown? Like, you feel that comfortable here?
Yeah, I really do. It started way back. I think the first time I was ever in Edmonton, I flew out west to see my girlfriend at the time, who was she was working at the Yathabee in Jasper,
right?
And I found out she was stooping some other dude there, and went back to Edmonton, my tail between my legs, heartbroken. And so the memory of that was a tough one, but I ended up some club just outside of town, picking up a guitar and playing. And even right then, I found the support. People kind of took you under their wing and were pretty supportive. So I ended up hanging around for about a week. But yeah, when we it just always felt comfortable to me. The working class nature of Edmonton,
With you living out west now, out in BC, how much of a change has that been? The one thing I always remember is your references to Georgian Bay and your cabin, your property up there. And actually, the thing that really kind of punched me in the face with the whole pandemic thing during COVID was you shot a little video of some foxes that were coming up to your sliding glass door. I don't know if it was just what you wrote or if there was, something that you said in the video on your social media post, but it just kind of hit me. I thought, man, this pandemic, it's not just freaking me and my wife and my kids out or other people. It's like, there's Tom. He's at his place in Georgian Bay, and the world has stopped for him too. Like this world has stopped for everybody. That really slapped me in the yap there when you posted that.
Yeah, and it seems like seems like a dream, now we all look back on it, and rarely does it come up in conversation, yet look at how it impacted the whole world, not just us, but I think it created an environment where in some cases, people got a chance to do a lot of soul searching, and I actually enjoyed the first summer, to be honest with you. First summer a long time. I wasn't booked with a bunch of shows and stuff, which I really enjoyed. You get to give the impression I don't enjoy it, but it gave me a chance. The only thing I'm surprised with, some people became very productive during that period, and I realized just how important performing live was to me as an artist, and not just the whole visceral idea and the inspirational idea of getting in front of people and getting that feedback and having people breathe life into your songs, because that's what it's like to me. It was always, performing art back in the day, 40s and the 50s, it was a means to an end. Recording, that was basically advertising for the shows. I mean, it wasn't intended to be this massive business that it became, the record business, that is. So yeah, I mean, it was a time of deep soul searching, and Foxes helped me with that. I became Fox Man. I saved one little fox, and I took him to a what were they called? The Aspen Wildlife Conservation people that saved baby animals that had been abandoned and stuff, and took little Tom, they called him, to those people, and they ended up releasing him back, and I'm pretty sure it was him, once he was grown up, kept coming to the door and kind of sniffing around the side of the door. You're not supposed to feed him, but I used to put eggs out for the foxes and stuff. But it was it was a time of deep soul searching, and we just seem to have blotted it out from our collective memories in a lot of cases.
You mentioned that summer that you had off and how nice it was, and then, do you remember your first gig after that all of the restrictions came down, and the first gig that you did after that? Was it?
Yeah, I mean, we started, so the first summer we are off, and then they kind of opened the floodgates a little bit in the second summer before we had another wave of it, and they shut things down. I think we did 8 shows the next summer, and I think the first one was Regina, and it was just phenomenal. The response was just, people were very happy to be there. We did one in Edmonton as well, and they had tables, and they had very strict rules with that. I think you might have come to that one, Terry.
Yeah, I was there for that one. Yeah.
And a lot of people there. It was very strange. So looking out, and it's a festival format, and yet there were tables as far as the eye could see, and people dancing between the tables, and security people making sure that nobody got too close. That was when you could have a certain number of people in your bubble, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so it was wonderful to get back out again. I remember that. I remember thinking that I'm going to do this as long as I can until the wheels fall off. It's like, why give up something that you love that much? It's part of who I am. So, I mean, at times, because of the travel and a lot of the BS that goes with that, and the inconvenience of some of that, you feel like quitting. But when you get in front of that audience, it's pretty special. Doing these duo shows in particular, I find that there's a certain three-dimensional element to it, where sometimes with the band, there's not quite that three-dimensional element. There's other stuff. There's a camaraderie with the boys before the show and the energy that you bring to it. But you don't have a chance to really exchange a lot of ideas. And I don't have a chance like I do with Bill or with Suzanne. When Suzanne comes out and plays cello, which I love, I don't have a chance to, or I have a chance, with that format to express ideas and talk about these stories that we're talking about right now. And I think the true fans really want to hear that stuff. Getting back to coming back after COVID, I was just shocked that I thought, wow, it's a rebirth of sorts, because I think the audiences were all under 30 years of age, because, a lot of older people didn't want to go out in public yet. So the audiences became quite a bit skewed younger.
The audience for the music that came out in the 80s, even the 90s, or for sure the 70s, is certainly getting younger. And I think the interest in the artists who made that music is at a heightened level, maybe more so than it ever has been, because we're starting to lose them. There's it seems like every couple of weeks we hear about another legendary artist who's lost a battle with this or has succumbed to that, or whatever the case may be. I mean, the other thing too is your music has been showing up in movies. What is it like for you to be watching a movie and all of a sudden a song that you wrote or a song that you performed, or somebody is performing a song like the Rascal Flatts in Cars, that movie? Like, what is it like for you to sit there, be watching something, and all of a sudden, hey, I wrote that?
I think it's wonderful. I mean, I think that in particular in the case of Rascal Flatts, it's an honor as a songwriter, and I mentioned this in the induction a few weeks ago as well, that one of the biggest honors for a songwriter is to have another artist cover their work, and indeed for that work to become, after a span of 16 years, lightning in a bottle again and become a huge hit again is pretty. Feel pretty blessed to have that happen. And so it's wonderful when people are playing. It's funny. My daughter, who lives in Brooklyn, New York, her husband was in a surf band from Brooklyn called the Drowners, and he could care less about Tom Cochrane. He was from New Jersey, and the lead singer went out with Dakota Johnson, actually came out to a show that I went to, but he could care less about Tom Cochrane until one day he comes running in and he says to Evan, your dad was in Family Guy. He was in Family Guy, because Eric used to smoke a fatty and watch Family Guy, and I didn't realize how big an impact this cartoon had. And he said, not only was your dad in Family Guy, like he was actually in it, his video was in it, and he was dancing with so-and-so and so-and-so from Family Guy. Then there was another part of Family Guy. They did it twice, used the song twice. There was another one where a bull goes into a bar, and he goes over to the jukebox machine and presses the button, and Life's a Highway comes on, and the bull starts to crash the place. And I wasn't really sure about the connective tissue between the plot of the show at that point and the bull trashing this place, but that's kind of cool when that happens. And then when things happen like Life's a Highway in The Office, for instance, all that stuff's pretty cool, because they're shows that are well respected and that have some impact. But I thought it was so funny, because I was a hero to my daughter's husband after that point, after being in Family Guy.
He was in a surf band called the Drowners, and he smokes a little weed, huh?
He smoked a little weed, among other things.
That's hilarious.
But yeah, it's pretty magical when that happens. And people often say to me, it's too bad Rascal Flatts stole your song. And I said, well, I wish they'd steal some more, because they put a lot of tanks of gas in the old tour bus,
Yeah, it's like the old adage, so many people hate Nickelback, I'd give my left nut if 10% of those people hated me.
That's right. That's right. And I love those guys. Those guys, when I got inducted in the Hall of Fame, so that was their first year or second year out, they're huge at that point. and they sent me this big platter of pierogies to my hotel room. And it was this big, beautiful silver platter of pierogies. And the pierogies were all about this big. They're massive. So I've always appreciated those guys. I think Chad told me at one point, he said the first song that they tried to tackle in their barn in Hannah was Lunatic Fringe. And they said they had to abandon it because they didn't know how the hell to play the keyboard parts. There was no keyboard player in the band. But that was one of the first songs they tried to cover. So I guess that was like their For Your Love that I would cover from the Yardbirds. It was zeitgeist for them at that point. But talk to Chad occasionally now, and we've been talking about collaborating. I'm not a great collaborator. I don't. To me, it's sort of a very solitary quest, dance with the muse, if you will, writing songs. And I don't judge people that do write as a committee. It just never has worked for me, probably because I've got ADHD. I just can't stay in a room that long. Bunch of people, I get antsy.
Yeah, there's the other thing too, the inspiration for some of the material that you've provided us for our listening enjoyment over the years. The whole Mad Mad World album spawned primarily out of your trips to Africa with the World Vision and all of the things that went with that. So, I mean, there's inspiration there that perhaps you can't share that collaborative sort of spirit with somebody who wasn't there. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say from the point of view that for me, I've often described songwriting in different ways. Like at its best, I'm a sonic journalist, for instance. I've said that before. But I think more than anything that we're therapists, as songwriters, and therapists for ourselves first and foremost. And hopefully the song resonates with a large number of people, because we all draw from the same palette, I think, as human beings, same palette of emotions. The circumstances change, of course. In the case of Life's a Highway, a lot of people are very surprised when I tell the story. And again, that's something I can't get into with a band. If you're playing to 12 or 15,000 people at a festival, they don't have a lot of patience to sit through talk like that, nor can maybe they hear the nuances of what you're talking about. But get a chance in the duo format to tell those stories and say, this song, it's ironic because it's one of the happiest songs ever written, I think. And yet it came from a place where I remember Kenny Greer hated the song, hated the sketch, because I would call a lot of my early demos or you'd write maybe a 15, 20 second bit of a song, and that one was mapped out, and it was called Love is a Highway. That was a working title. I think Paul McCartney had scrambled eggs for yesterday before he came up with the final lyric. And that's kind of yeah, and that's kind of the way I would work too. I would jam. If I sat down and try to write a lyric while I'm listening to the song, or disconnected from the song in terms of playing and the cadence and the rhythm of the song, very rarely would those lyrics pan out. I found I had to jam the song with the idea in mind of the emotion I'm trying to get across in the song. And a lot of it would be scat singing. It would be meaningless stuff. And every once in a while, there'd be a kernel of what we call a hook that would appear. But the idea of the song was usually in place, and the emotion I wanted to transmit or communicate was in place. Then it was a matter of fleshing it out after jamming it and getting the cadence right and the nuances right, because that's the most important part. So I would jam it almost like a sax player, and that's how I would come up with a lot of the lyrics, as opposed to actually sitting down at a typewriter with a pen and paper writing it. And in the case of Life's a Highway, I just saw all these. My first trip to Africa with World Vision back in the late 80s left a lot of scars on my psyche. I mean, we were in war zones. We saw people die in front of us. My goodness, mother died in her daughter's arms, and she's looking up at us like, why are you guys there with your cameras and your pens? Why didn't you save my mother? And that hit me pretty hard. And I guess psychologists will call it transference, but I saw my daughters in her eyes, and that hit me pretty hard. So I came home and I was trying to deal with this. I guess I had a little bit of post-trauma stress disorder from that point of view, and would wake up at night in cold sweats and stuff. And then I got up one one night about 3 a.m, which I would do a lot, get up in the middle of the night to finish an idea or I'd have an epiphany. And, I went out to my little shed in Oakville and fired up my microphone, my preamp and my recorder. And by 6 a.m, the song was written. It was like a pep talk to myself to pull me out of this funk. And indeed it did. And then obviously it became a pep talk to millions of other people. So the message of the song being basically that you got to keep your eye on the road ahead of you, or you're going to crash. So dear friend of mine, Dave Toyson, said to me once, Tom, I said to him, Dave, you're just enabling some of these corrupt governments to do this and do that. And he said, if we can help one kid get out of here and maybe go to school, they can come back and they can help change their country. But that's not our job. Our job is to save lives one kid at a time. And so that made a lot of sense to me. And I realized in the song I'm writing, and he described it as pebbles in a pond, and the ripples going out and they affect people, on the periphery out here and out here. But you got to keep your eye on the road ahead of you and try to do some good along that road. And hopefully it spreads out from there. So, I take that and what my dad used to tell me about, doesn't cost a lot, Tom, to be nice. It really doesn't cost a lot. And you'll find in some incredible way it pays dividends in the end, just to be nice to people, if only in the way you feel about yourself. So that's kind of the message of the song. You got to keep your eye on the road ahead of you and try to do some good along the way. And then hopefully it spreads out from there. But if you get all distracted by what's right and left of you, for instance, today, you and I can no more control or affect political decisions or what's happening in the States or wherever else. It's worthy having the conversation, but it's not, we still got to concentrate on how we affect people that are close to us every day. And, just the clerk in the grocery store even, or whatever. And it's amazing, if you spread a little bit of good along the way, just help people smile and they open up and maybe they spread it to the person next to them. And so, the song has a pretty simple message that way. And I don't think the song would have seen the light of day if it wasn't for that. Because I remember John Webster Sanchez to my Don Quixote, what was always kicking my ass. He said, "You've got to finish that. You've got to finish that." So we had actually done the demo of it. We had done what ended up on the record. A lot of the parts that we recorded stood the test of time, and Joe Hardy would try to replace certain things. We said, no, we want to stick with the parts that we recorded and the parts that we laid down in the studio. And so a lot of that stuff stood the test of time, and we had this whole thing mapped out. So I did have the song kind of mapped out, but I didn't have lyrics for it. And I said, John, it's too commercial. Like I just can't wrap my head around this, or my heart, until after that trip. And then that's exactly what I needed to offset this very heavy experience. And then the lyrics gave it some gravitas, so that that affected a lot of people. So it's pretty cool when you can achieve that sort of thing. Now, people often say, well, did you know it was going to be a hit song? No, you don't know stuff. You just try to put some paint on the canvas and express yourself and get these ideas off your chest. And then it becomes a song, and hopefully affects a lot of people. And obviously, they don't come along all the time. There's other songs that I really love that I think should have more impact than they did or do. Napoleon Sheds His Skin being a good example. But they don't hit that massive zeitgeist nerve that Life's a Highway did, that affected so many people. I feel very blessed to have written that song, and Big League, of course, and Boy, and White Hot, Human Race, some of those songs that have become so-called hits to varying degrees. And I don't think any of those songs, Lunatic Fringe, massive. A lot of people don't realize in Canada that it had the impact that it had in the States, for instance. To me, they're songs that I'm still just as proud to play them, and they still feel just as vital now as they did when I wrote them. I know, like Lunatic Fringe, for instance, my goodness, I was getting so much pressure from management and everybody else. They're going, what are you doing? Let's just write some hit songs and get on. Let's write some pop stuff and get on with it. You're going through that kind of pressure, and I remember we were demoing the song with my, became my buddy, Fraser Hill. He was the second engineer at that time, and he didn't know what the fuck he was doing. He laid the song down. We were burning the tape, like the levels were way too, this thing was all distorted stuff in it, but it had a pretty cool kind of Clash vibe to it. And at that point, I'm still thinking, maybe they're right. Got to get on and do something. And he came on the foldback system and he said, John Lennon's been shot. And I thought, that just hit me like a ton of bricks. And at first I said, Fraser, that's a bad joke. He said, no, it's not a joke. It's true. It's happened. And then I thought, well, for better or for worse, here's a guy that always wore his heart on his sleeve, in spite of the incredible mass success that they had, and tried to express a lot of ideas that were controversial sometimes. And I thought, well, for better or for worse, this song's going to stand as it is, and I'm not going to change a thing, and it became this juggernaut that it did. I mean, I think it was 8 or 10 weeks at number one on the U.S. album-oriented rock chart. I mean, that was unprecedented that day. It set a record. It bumped Start Me Up and Stones off that chart, out of first place.
Yeah, those guys will never amount to anything.
Yeah, never. Nothing. And so it was pretty cool when that happened. And every week, Friday Morning Quarterback or whatever the tip sheets were back then, Tommy Nass tip sheet as well, that it would be number one again. And it was just such an incredible ride with that song because it was unique. A lot of our contemporaries back then were going on stage with ZZ Top and some of these bands who had a pretty roughneck crowd, part of their crowds, and these bands would get pelted with shit, and they leave the stage and they come back with hard hats on and stuff. Loverboy being one of them, and but nobody wanted to mess with us because even though we looked like a bunch of nerds, Red Rider in the beginning, and which we kind of were, and but nobody wanted to mess with us because of Lunatic Fringe. They figured these guys mean business, so
you were crazy.
These guys mean business, so we're not going to mess with them. So that song gave us a certain
gravitas
and street credential.
We'll be right back.
This podcast, reluctantly, brought to you by Just for Feet. Just for Feet, just around the corner from the Sally Ann. No pants, no hats, no jackets. None of that stuff's for feet. Just for Feet. Don't come to us looking for gloves.
Reluctantly.
You talked about getting pierogies from Nickelback.
I got pierogied by Nickelback.
And then you talk about, other bands that were doing tours with ZZ Top, and then the Loverboy, and then I just it popped into my head. Was there, as you were touring, either having other acts open for you or you opening for other acts, was there, some practical jokes back and forth, a la the pierogies from Nickelback, that you can remember?
Well, if we reached the end of the tour, very often one of our favorite things to do was to gaffer tape our road manager to a chair and stick him on the middle of the stage with his face gaffer taped and stuff. It wasn't terribly politically correct times, but things of that nature. The April Wine guys, that was our first arena tour. And I think we started in Sault Ste. Marie and then Winnipeg. And they were a lot of fun. I mean, Jerry Mercer, there's all kinds of stuff. Most of it I can't talk about. Stuff backstage, massive food fights and up and down. Just making a mess of things. But I remember, in regards to other bands, as much contention as I might have had with Bruce Allen, the legendary Bruce Allen from Vancouver, he did us a lot of good in a way. The education I got with our 10 years Red Rider with Bruce Allen, when I look back at it in retrospect, we wouldn't have got a lot of the tours we got. Like we opened for the Beach Boys. That was a big education. That's a whole other story. I don't know if I can talk about a lot of that stuff because of the non-disclosure agreement. It was pretty wild. And then, but Ray Davies and the Kinks, that was, they were playing sold out shows and everywhere, you know, Madison Square Gardens and Spectrum in Philadelphia, and of course in Canada, you know, Maple Leaf Gardens and Rexall Place and all that. And we opened for them. And that was a real education, because I was a huge Kings fan growing up. I remember at the Spectrum, Philadelphia, we're watching the show, and there's scaffolding and the stairs going down under the scaffolding, and that we're at the top. We're sort of semi-side stage. And Dave Davies walked over and horked at Mick Avery. And Mick Avery took a snare drum and he threw it at Dave Davies, and he jumped off the drum riser. He came around the side, says, "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to get him. I'm going to rip his throat out." And it was like Keystone Cops. They're running around the arena. This was 17,000 people in the arena, and without missing a beat. Ray, God bless Ray, man, incredible performer. He grabs acoustic guitar, go into Lola without missing a beat. Like, this happened every night kind of thing. And phenomenal performer. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of experiences with those guys. I learned so much from Ray Davies as a showman in that band. It was an amazing tour. And then Jay Giles, Peter Wolf doesn't get enough attention. Peter Wolf actually brought Van Morrison to North America. A lot of people don't realize it. Peter Wolf who's the lead singer of Jay Giles, started, and this is freeze frame for those of you that don't know it was. And I think Tom Petty on his last tour had Peter Wolf open for him. Very well-respected artist, an incredibly conscientious man. He brought Van Morrison and his family over and put them up in his 2-bedroom apartment, I think, and got him shows in Boston. So Van Morrison actually started in Boston in North America, and then he ended up San Francisco. But that was Peter Wolf. He was a great proponent of music, and so not just a great performer himself. And we toured with those guys, and their record went to #1, and we played the last show with them in Chicago, the infamous Aragon Ballroom. And they set a record for temperatures. It was like 25, 30 below zero about 5 days before Christmas, and they're wrapping it up for Christmas and the New Year's. And this is how strange America could be back then. They had the #1 record in North America, and there's 800 people had bought tickets. And we were all kind of a little bit disenchanted by that, and his crew included. And he got everybody together, and we went on for sound check, and we had plaster falling on our head from the ceiling, and the dressing rooms had rats in them. So we were hunkered down in our bus trying to keep it as warm as we could as a dressing room. But Peter Wolf got everybody together, and he said, "I don't care if one person has bought a ticket for this show. We're going to give that one person the best damn show of their life." And I really respected that. He did. Every night he brought it. And they got along, and a lot of the bands that we toured with didn't get along. Rush got along, man. They were just brothers. The great bands are like that. They're like brothers, man. Rush is like that. Stones are probably like that. I like to at least visualize they're like that. You know, right after that tour, now I learned so much from him, and I borrowed some stuff from him, some showman stuff. He'd get on stage, for instance, with the par lamp and start shining it on different sections of the audience. Well, that might ring a bell. He would also come down out of the rafters doing his swogan, his dance, and people would go crazy, and he'd make his way down to the stage. And I borrowed that one too later in my career in the early 90s, you know, when we had a big enough audience and a big enough crowd, and come down from the sound console, right? Make my way to the stage like Peter Wolf. But you know who else did that? Was a guy that you might have heard of, you know. I thought they should have been the guy named Bono. So they talk about him in The Unforgettable Fire and the same stuff. So they went out with him after we finished with him. So when they went back out in January, U2 went out opening for Jay Giles. And Bono even talks about how influenced some of his showmanship was by Jay Giles with the par lamp and coming down from the rafters and stuff. So Peter Wolf was great. Peter Wolf, actually, the first show we did was Joe Louis Arena in Detroit. and he came into the dressing room with 2 big bottles of champagne, put them down. He said, it's a great pleasure. So, no, Peter Wolf was amazing. And he said to me, I want you to tell me what Lunatic Fringe is about. He said, I know what it's about, but I want you to tell me. And I told him what it was about. It was an anti-racist song. Obviously it mentions Final Solution in the song, which, as a kid, I was always incredibly fascinated and horrified by the Holocaust. It probably was something that impacted me more than anything else in my life, just in terms of being somebody that's interested in the human condition and what we do to each other and why we do it to each other. And it's just something that I've always grappled with, and I touch on it in that song as well. But he, and basically saying, we're not, those of us out here that are good people, we're not going to let that happen again. But yeah, I really respected him a lot for that, just how kind he was and how genuinely interested he was. Probably, cut from the same mold as Springsteen. Obviously not the same career trajectory, but yeah, they made a big impact on me.
Actually, I just, the thing that popped into my head when you were talking about how Jay Giles treated you and the rest of the guys in the band when that was happening makes me think of the same sort of thing when I don't know if it was your last visit or the visit before, when the band Nice Horse opened up for you at the River Cree. Mm-hmm. And at that time it was the 5 girls, and now it's Katie and Brandy. I recently saw them at Clayton Bellamy's charity golf tournament in Bonnyville. They just sang the national anthem for the Seattle Seahawks game on the weekend. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah,
but it's the same sort of thing. You learn from something, an experience like that with Peter Wolf, and then you just years later, I can see it. I'm fortunate enough to be in an environment where I can see that relationship between you and bands that are coming up or that are going to, go somewhere or whatever the case. So it's great to see that carry on.
Yeah, I've always tried to pay it forward with bands and artists that have opened for me, and some of the bands I'm disappointed didn't go on to do bigger things, but their music still stands the test of time. Northern Pikes would be a good example. Wonderful band. Yeah. Grapes of Wrath, who I produced their early EP and then their first record, but really wonderful artists. We always tried to be the best we could, and we never locked horns with any of the acts that opened for us. I've always felt like you got to pay it forward a little bit and treat those artists in the manner that you wanted to be treated and that you were treated in some cases when you were opening for people. We never held back sound, which was sort of the way a lot of people did business when the opening acts. So we just did, actually back in the spring, and it's like for a lot of people, I don't know whether they thought I was dead or what, but we actually got called in. I was a bit nervous about it. I got called to do by Live Nation to do and Vinny Sancamani, my agent, to open for the Eagles.
I see. Yeah, that was going to be my next conversation. Yes.
Yeah. So unfortunately, irony of the whole thing is that we subbed for Steely Dan.
Yeah.
Who, as much as I love the Eagles and they were a big influence on me in the early 70s, I suppose, as they were so many other artists, especially the artists that were of my nature, which was a singer-songwriter who transitioned into being in a band and doing a lot of rock stuff. They kind of covered that territory. And, and the Jackson Browne connection, of course, who I really loved.
Sure.
As an artist. But yeah, it just, I forget the point I was going to make, but the thing is about the Eagles, a lot of people should know better said, that's the best you've ever sounded. That's unbelievable. Well, these guys they opened the floodgates for us and gave us all the sound, all the lights. It was just, they were very generous that way. I suppose some of that came down the pipe from Irving Azoff. I don't know, but they were just wonderful. And it was great opening for them. And a lot of people, a lot of friends in that, I got tons of texts. Oh, "Man, it's good to know you're still alive. You're still out there doing it." I said, "Well, we're always out there doing it." But it's just amazing how the impact of a band like that, how big it is. The irony being is I've never seen Steely Dan live, and I'm a huge Steely Dan fan.
Yeah,
And
me too.
Here we are subbing for them. Fagan was going through some really tough stuff with his wife. I think she had a very serious operation, and that we all can relate to that. And so it was the first thing I said. I sent out best wishes to him and his family. But I was kind of nervous because I thought, if I had paid for a Steely Dan ticket, I definitely wouldn't want to see Tom Cochrane on stage. But it was just a huge ovation, and people were incredibly.
Well, you just say,
great.
"Hey, as much as you want to hear Bodhisattva right now, here's Lunatic Fringe."
Yeah, I said we're going to play a little bit of Asia, but we can't remember all the chords, so we're going to play.
They're all in there.
We're going to play some simpler stuff. No, I was always a huge Steely Dan fan. So, that was a lot of fun, that gig. But it is funny because so many people said it's good to know, good to see you're back at it, and really.
2024 was a year that there was, and it's not like it really went away, but there was a rejuvenated, energized enthusiasm for the Tragically Hip with the 4-part documentary on Prime. I'm guessing you watched it.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we talked earlier in this episode about, the road trips and the guys in the van. If there ever was the epitome of that story and that scenario of how a band comes up, it's the Tragically Hip starting in Kingston and traveling all over the place. And, Last American Exit was they piled out of the van right in front of the K97 studios on 108th Street when I was working there, and came in and talked to Irene, did the interview with Dave Baker. That was the first time I met them. And, your relationship with the Tragically Hip over the years was a special one, and with Gord Downey. And what just generally, what were your thoughts on the documentary aside from, just powerful?
I thought it was powerful. I thought it was extremely honest. I mean, if you're going to write a screenplay about a band and it's going to be fictional, it would probably be like that. And ironically, the name aptly describes what happened to them, what happened to Gord. And it was, I don't know what there is to say about it other than there's things that I know about it that weren't revealed, that weren't talked about. But in general, it was a really honest revelation on the band. I think we all love to think that they were, because again, I think some of these great bands, and I hate to say it because Red Rider, we don't fall in the same ilk as those bands, because I joined the band fairly late, but those guys all grew up with each other. The Rush guys, they're really a band of brothers. Our band was a band of brothers with me and Kenny to a certain degree, but I was always the late guy into the game. And a lot of the early members didn't like that because they wanted to do Steely Dan type material. They wanted to do jazz fusion. They wanted to do stuff that was a little bit more ornate, complicated. And albeit, fair to some of those guys, they had a small but loyal following for that. And they probably, if the chips fell in a different place, would have become a jam band, like Grateful Dead or perhaps Fifth, exploring some more complicated terrain musically in terms of not being as locked into a format. So a lot of those guys didn't like the fact that here's this folk singer joining the band that hardly knows how to tune his guitars, So it was a big learning curve for me when I joined the band, and very necessary at the time, because it made me become a much more competent musician and artist. But in that sense, getting back to the Hip, they were truly and are truly a band of brothers. I'm probably closest to Paul and Gord, and Paul never hesitates. And very few artists will do this in this country. even though I think it's a pretty good community, it wasn't as much that way. It was so competitive in the 70s, and the forces that would be were really kind of would tear bands apart, would tear the fabric apart of musicians, because musicians were so frustrated because we're always told that we're not as good as the Brits or the Americans, and pretend you're not Canadian. I was told that, and I said,
Right.
no, I'm not going to do that. When we had the first record, I said, I'm going to talk about being Canadian. I'm going to talk about my roots. And I admire Tragically Hip for that. I admire Rodeo a bit for that. I will toot my own horn by saying that I fought it to the point that by the time we hit the mid-'80s, Canadians were ready to have their own artists, and they didn't give a damn whether those artists were internationally famous or successful. And so we were one of the artists that helped set the table for that, in that we refused to deny that we were Canadian. We always embraced it. I always embraced it in conversations and in interviews. And we helped set the table for an environment that was more conducive to Canadians saying, what we're doing here is special, and we are special, and we don't care if other people don't get it. And the Tragically Hip, obviously, were the next big vanguard of that, them and Rodeo, Blue Rodeo guys. So, but you got to remember, I was doing it. I mean, we had 5 records out by that point, and they were all pretty damn successful. I mean, we were nominated for 12 Junos before we ever won one. Ironically enough, the first one I think was Singer-Songwriter of the Year. But those guys kind of took that step farther. That documentary explores it, and it explores it with a great deal of honesty and panache, and it's a struggle. There's one point in the documentary where Gord talks about the music business as a carrot on a stick, and it's so true, because they keep dangling that carrot, and you keep pursuing that carrot, and it's never quite the way you think it's going to be when you get there. It's like a lot of things in life. So you better have your ducks in a row in terms of believing in the music, believing in what you're doing, believing in each other. And that's what helps bands like the Tragically Hip, like U2, from what I could see. And of course, Blue Rodeo guys and that stick together. But it unabashedly, addresses the whole idea in that, and they could have avoided it, because we all like to think that they were always really solid. They never locked heads, and it explores that whole aspect of when I think Bob Rock was producing, and they felt like he was deferring way too much attention to Gord.
Yeah.
The other guys felt excluded in that. And those are the forces of the music business that can sometimes rip bands apart. Those guys hung in, and then, they went through a period of adjustment there where they were losing their audience and all that stuff. And again, tragically enough, this horrible thing happens to Gord, and it makes everybody realize, like we do in life, that sometimes those stark realities are what would bind you together stronger, pull you together. And so I almost get teared up thinking about it. Felt that way toward at the end of that documentary.
Oh, for sure, I did. That's just knowing the guys the way we do. So,
don't you think it's ironic, Terry, that 2 of our greatest artists as Canadians, Gordon Downie and Neil Peart, succumbed to the same thing? I remember reading something about Woody Guthrie. There was a theory by some neurosurgeons and psychologists in that your body knows what's going on. Sometimes this ticking time bomb in there, and that forces you to achieve things and strive for things and push hard for things that you may not have done, because time is of the essence. You just know that subconsciously. Your body knows that. I don't know. Maybe it happened in the case of those 2 guys, but they were phenomenally influential artists, and thank God we had the time we had with them.
Absolutely. Tom, I thank you for the time that you shared with me today. It's always a treat to chat with you. I hope that we can do this again, and I hope to see you perform again real soon. Can't wait to stand on the stage and tell anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 people that you are indeed a Canadian treasure.
Well, I love it, man. When you get up there and when you do that for us, it's always a special moment. And one of these days, I'm going to get up to the Shuswap with you, and maybe we'll have a couple of frosty ones together and go do some fishing or whatever. But
fishing and golfing.
Always good seeing you, man. Good
All right,
talk.
man. Thank you, Tom.
All right, buddy. Thanks, Terry.
Reluctantly.
Today's podcast brought to you by the Clayton Bellamy Foundation for the Arts, supporting education and community-based programs in the province of Alberta by providing financial support to arts programs in need. ClaytonBellamyFoundation.org.
Reluctantly.